woman in tears after burying her mother, in desperation, sought out her friend to collect a debt. Having been refused and humiliated, she decided to take an unexpected course of action. The sky was covered with thick, dark clouds as if nature itself was in mourning. A light drizzle fell over the cemetery, wrapping everything in a sense of emptiness and cold. Clara stood motionless before the freshly dug grave, her eyes fixed on the coffin slowly descending into the earth. Her mother, her only safe harbor, now descending to a place Clara could never reach again. The wind cut across her skin, but the pain inside was infinitely colder. It was a dull, heavy ache that crushed her chest like a boulder. The few people present murmured prayers, but the words dissipated into the air, meaningless to Clara. She couldn't hear anything except the hollow sound of the coffin touching the bottom of the grave. Her body trembled slightly, not from the cold but from the devastating reality before her eyes. Life had become an unbearable burden. Medical debts piled up like lurking shadows, threatening to swallow all that remained of her sanity. Clara gripped the handkerchief tightly in her hands, trying to find some comfort in that piece of cloth, but the emptiness around her only seemed to grow. She looked around as if desperately seeking an escape from the pain, but all she saw was sorrow. The faces around her were distant, lost in their own thoughts. None of them could understand what she was going through. Some offered looks of pity, but Clara didn't want pity, she wanted her mother back. She felt as if she were floating, trapped between despair and the need to continue. The sound of dirt being thrown onto the coffin brought Clara back to the present. Each shovelful of earth that fell onto the wood felt like a direct blow to her heart. When the ceremony ended, people slowly began to disperse, murmuring words of comfort that Clara couldn't absorb. She remained where she was, unable to move as the grave was closed. It seemed surreal that in a matter of minutes, the woman who had raised her, who had loved her unconditionally, was now forever beneath the cold ground. She wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to hold together the broken pieces of her heart, but all she felt was an abyss opening inside her. The rain began to fall more heavily, running through Clara's hair and mixing with the tears she could no longer contain. The world around her seemed as distant as it was unreachable. Each drop of rain was a bitter reminder of her new reality. She was alone. Clara looked toward the horizon, but all she saw was a gray blur. Deaths surrounded her like silent predators, waiting for the right moment to strike. She had nowhere left to run. Without her mother and without money, life seemed like a lost battle. Tired, Clara finally moved, her heavy feet sinking into the wet mud. She felt each step as a struggle against gravity, as if the world itself were trying to pull her down. Her shoes were dirty and the rain now fell harder, but none of it mattered. Her only thought was that she needed to find a way to survive the pain, the chaos, and the debts that now seemed unbearable. Something inside her refused to give up, but she didn't know what to do next. As Clara walked away from the grave, she felt a wave of despair transform into something new, a kind of grim determination. Daniel's face appeared in her mind. He owed her money, a significant sum that could at least relieve part of the burden she carried. It was her last hope. But now, what she feared most was the possibility of being rejected, of being ignored by someone she had always considered a friend. She wasn't ready for another betrayal, not after losing her mother. But at that moment, Clara realized she had to try. Because if she didn't, all that would be left was emptiness. As she walked through the rain, Clara found herself taken back to memories that transported her to a simpler time when life seemed uncomplicated and full of color. She remembered running through the green fields of her childhood, with Daniel always by her side, their laughter echoing in the air. They were inseparable, sharing secrets, dreams, and even the silliest adventures. Back then, Daniel was her protector, someone she trusted more than anyone else. Together, they swore they would never drift apart. Clara smiled bitterly as she recalled the first time Daniel defended her from a group of boys at school. She was only 8 years old, and Daniel, 2 years older, appeared like a hero, chasing away the bullies with courage. He looked at her that afternoon, his eyes shining with determination, and said, "I'll always take care of you." In that moment, she believed him with all her heart. That childhood promise seemed as real, as solid, as the ground beneath her feet. But that sweet memory was cut short by another, one that revealed the subtle but devastating change that had taken place over the years. Clara remembered the last time she had seen Daniel before everything started to fall apart. He was no longer the easygoing boy but a cold and distant man. Their conversations, once intimate and full of camaraderie, had turned into brief and impersonal exchanges. She couldn't understand how he had turned into the stranger who barely looked her in the eyes. She recalled a specific afternoon in their early teens when the two of them sat under a large tree in the field, watching the sunset. Daniel had talked about his plans about being successful, having power, and making money. Clara, on the other hand, only wanted to live in peace, close to her mother and the people she loved. At the time, she couldn't imagine that his dreams would take him so far away from her, not just physically but emotionally as well. It was painful for Clara to think that the kind boy had turned into the man who now ignored and, even worse, humiliated her. She wondered at what point exactly he had changed. Had his relentless pursuit of success eaten away at him? Or maybe the years had distanced them more than she realized, and when she looked again, there were no traces left of the friend she once knew? The memories came in fragments, like scenes from an old movie, each bringing with it a pang of longing and disappointment. She remembered Daniel's warm smile, how he made her laugh with his silly jokes, and how he always seemed to know what to say to calm her down when things got tough. But now that smile had vanished, replaced by a mask of indifference that hurt her deeply. The pain of losing her mother mixed with the pain of losing Daniel, even though he was still alive. As Clara walked through the wet streets, she couldn't help but compare the past with the present. Daniel used to be her safe harbor, the one in whom she trusted her deepest secrets. But now he was just a shadow of the boy who had promised to protect her. The void he left was almost as large as the one her mother had left, and the feeling of betrayal only grew as she remembered everything they had been through together. Despite the sweet memories, there was a growing bitterness inside her. The promises of eternal friendship had disappeared like leaves in the wind, and the harsh reality of who Daniel had become hit her hard. He was no longer that loyal and caring friend, but rather a man driven by his own interests. Clara felt as though she had been betrayed twice, once by the death of her mother and once by Daniel's transformation into a cold stranger. Even so, the memories kept coming, as if her heart were desperately trying to salvage something good from what was left of their friendship. She remembered how they had built a small, makeshift cabin in Daniel's backyard, promising that it would be their secret hideaway. It was a place where the world couldn't touch them, where only the two of them existed. But now Clara wondered where that hideaway had gone. Maybe it was buried in the same shadows that swallowed up the friend she loved. Part of her wanted to believe that there was still something of the old Daniel hidden somewhere, but another part knew that the man she was about to confront was no longer her friend. He was a stranger, and that stranger owed her not just money but also an explanation for the silent abandonment and coldness he had shown her when she needed him most. The stacks of bills were scattered across Clara's table like a cruel reminder of her reality. The invoices, with their terrifying numbers, seemed to mock her helplessness. Each envelope she opened was another stab to her heart, another confirmation that she was sinking into a bottomless pit. Her mother's medical expenses, accumulated over months of treatment, were merciless. The debt grew like a monstrous shadow, hovering over her, ever-present, suffocating. Sitting at the small table in her kitchen, Clara stared at the numbers, desperately trying to understand how she had gotten there. Her job barely covered the basic expenses, and since her mother's death, the deadlines for payment had become impossible to meet. She had already sold everything she could. The car, the watch she inherited from her father, the few family jewels. Nothing was left except the house, which could be taken by creditors at any moment. She felt the weight of the decisions before her, and none of the paths seemed promising. Every day the calls from debt collectors became more insistent. The phone rang incessantly, an agonizing soundtrack to her life. She no longer answered the calls, knowing that every voice on the other end would bring more threats, more pressure. Clara was trapped in a hellish cycle, a labyrinth with no exit. Even the nights, which once offered some temporary relief in the form of sleep, were now filled with nightmares about losing everything, becoming homeless, losing her dignity. She had tried looking for alternatives, but each one seemed like a dead end. The banks denied her any new loans, and the few friends she had were also facing their own difficulties and couldn't help her. Clara no longer knew who to turn to. She felt completely alone. The debts, like an unbearable weight, crushed her from all sides, making it difficult to even breathe. Each beat of her heart felt like a countdown to collapse. She knew she needed to act, but she was paralyzed by anxiety and fear. And then, amid this internal chaos, a memory flashed like a light in the darkness: Daniel. Clara remembered that he still owed her a significant amount of money, a loan she had made a few years ago before her life turned upside down. At that time the amount seemed modest, a favor for a friend. But now that money was her only hope. If Daniel kept his promise and paid what he owed, maybe she could get back on her feet. It was the only solution left, the last thread of hope she could hold on to. Clara hesitated for a moment, the fear of being rejected or ignored overwhelming her thoughts. But desperation spoke louder. She knew that without that money she wouldn't be able to last much longer. Her pride, which until then had kept her from asking for help, began to crumble. She had to face Daniel, she had to try or she would lose everything. The idea of confronting him filled her with uncertainty, but there was no other option. Her survival depended on it. Amid the growing pressure, Clara began gathering the necessary documents to prove the debt. She organized her old notes, found the transfer receipts, and mentally rehearsed how she would approach the subject with Daniel. Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions: sadness for what she had lost, anxiety for the future, and a glimmer of hope that, though fragile, still existed. She rehearsed her words in silence, imagining what the meeting would be like, whether he would remember the debt or pretend that nothing had happened. What hurt the most was the fact that Clara had never imagined she would have to ask Daniel for something he knew he owed. She had always believed he would be honorable, that he would repay when he could, without her needing to collect. But now time had run out, and his silence, which once seemed harmless, was starting to feel calculated. Clara could sense the betrayal creeping closer, like a wound that hadn't yet opened but could start bleeding intensely at any moment. With a heavy heart, but determined, Clara decided that she would confront Daniel the next day. The thought of being humiliated or rejected haunted her, but her need was greater than her fear. She knew she couldn't wait or hesitate any longer. This was her only chance to avoid imminent collapse. All that remained was her courage and the hope that Daniel still held on to some humanity. Clara crossed the bustling streets of the city with her heart racing. Each step seemed to echo in her mind, mixing anxiety with hope. When she arrived at the elegant restaurant where Daniel had arranged to meet, she paused for a moment at the entrance, trying to gather the last of her courage. The place was dazzling. Soft lights illuminated tables covered with white linen cloths, and a subtle scent of sophisticated food filled the air. Clara, in her simple coat and tired eyes, felt out of place. The contrast between that luxury and her own reality was brutal. Daniel was seated at a table near the window, his face relaxed and confident, with a glass of wine delicately resting between his fingers. He looked casually at the city's movement outside, as if he were oblivious to any worries the world might impose on him. As Clara approached, he looked up, giving her a superficial smile. "Clara, good to see you," he said, his voice calm as ever. But there was something in that tranquility that made Clara's stomach churn. The familiarity was gone, and now she saw him as a stranger. Sitting down slowly, Clara felt her hands tremble slightly. She tried to hide the nervousness, aiming to appear strong and decisive. After a few minutes of small talk and meaningless pleasantries, the silence became heavy. Clara knew she couldn't postpone what she came to say any longer. Taking a deep breath, she finally brought up the subject. "Daniel, I wanted to talk to you about that debt." Her voice came out lower than she expected, almost a whisper, but it carried all the weight of what she was facing. She held her breath, waiting for his reaction. Daniel tilted his head slightly, his smile fading for a moment. His eyes, which had been friendly, turned distant, almost cold. He set the wineglass down on the table with an irritating calm and looked at Clara, as if analyzing a chess piece. "Debt?" he repeated, as though he didn't understand what she was referring to. The silence that followed was suffocating. Clara felt the heat rise to her face. How could he pretend not to know? "Yes, Daniel," she continued, her voice now a little firmer. "The money I lent you a few years ago. I really need it now. Things are hard for me." Clara knew she was exposing her vulnerability, but she had no choice. She needed that money, and Daniel knew it. He knew what that amount meant to her. What he would do next would determine more than just the debt. It would determine her future. Daniel laughed, a dry and emotionless laugh that cut through the air like a blade. "Ah, Clara, that was so long ago," he said, shaking his head. "I thought we were past that stage." He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms nonchalantly. His eyes no longer showed any trace of the boy who had once promised to always stand by her side. Clara felt a knot tighten in her throat, a sense of betrayal she couldn't shake. "Daniel, you know it's not a small thing. I helped you when you needed it, and now—" Clara tried to stay calm, but the frustration and desperation in her voice were evident. She was trying to stand firm, but the way he looked at her, as if what she said was irrelevant, weakened her. Every word he spoke made her feel smaller and smaller. He interrupted her, raising a hand in the air. "Clara, listen," Daniel said, with a paternalistic tone that made her blood boil. "I know you're going through a tough time, but you can't put that on me. I have my own responsibilities, my own problems." He spoke as though dealing with a demanding child and not a friend in despair. The coldness in his voice cut her like invisible knives. To Clara, it felt as if he were stripping away any dignity she had left. She stayed silent for a moment, absorbing the impact of his words. The restaurant, so full of life and light around them, seemed to slowly fade away as though the world were disappearing. All that remained was that table, the heavy atmosphere between them. Clara looked at Daniel, searching his eyes for any sign of empathy, any flicker of the friend she once knew. But all she found was indifference, a wall she would never be able to break through. Feeling the sting of rejection taking root deep in her chest, Clara realized that this encounter would not turn out as she had hoped. The man sitting across from her was no longer her friend. He had become someone else, someone she barely recognized, someone who seemed to take pleasure in watching her beg. Daniel let out a bitter laugh as if Clara's plea were a tasteless joke. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table and looking at her with a mixture of disdain and condescension. "Clara, let's be honest," he said with a cold smile. "You're blowing this all out of proportion." "Money? Seriously? I thought you had more pride than that." His voice carried a mocking tone, as if her situation were insignificant, a minor inconvenience he barely considered. Clara felt the blood rush through her veins, boiling. Her face grew pale as Daniel's cruel words penetrated her mind. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. All she could do was stare at Daniel, stunned, as if he had suddenly transformed into a complete stranger. "I'm not exaggerating, Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely holding back tears. "I'm on the verge of collapse. This is no joke." But Daniel didn't seem interested in her words. He leaned back again, crossing his arms with an expression of pure disdain. "If you're in that situation, Clara, that's your problem," he said with a cutting indifference. "Everyone has problems. Do you think that just because you're crying, I'll open my wallet and save you? Grow up. Life is hard for everyone." His words stung like whips, each one leaving an invisible but deeply painful mark. Clara blinked, trying to absorb the emotional blow, but every part of her was shaking. It was as if the ground beneath her feet had disappeared. Daniel, the friend she had trusted so much, was now humiliating her as though she were just a beggar, not someone who, in a moment of need, had helped him without hesitation. She wasn't sure what hurt more, his refusal to help or the coldness with which he treated her. He took a sip of his wine, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were savoring not just the drink, but also the power he had over her. "You really need to stop acting like a victim," he continued without a trace of empathy. "I'm not going to solve your problems, Clara. If you're in this situation, maybe you should have thought more carefully before making certain decisions. It's not my responsibility." The cruelty in his words was almost unbearable. Tears began to well up in Clara's eyes, but she fought them back, trying to maintain some shred of dignity. She didn't want to cry in front of Daniel. She didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. But the knot in her throat tightened more with each passing second. She felt as though she was being torn apart inside, her hopes crumbling before her eyes. Never had she imagined hearing such words from someone who was once so close to her. Daniel didn't stop. He seemed determined to push her even further down. "You've always been a bit dramatic, Clara," he said with a cynical smile. "I thought that after all this time, you would have learned to be more practical, stronger. But it seems that time has only made you weaker." The contempt in his voice was like poison. Clara felt a wave of nausea rising, the shame burning her cheeks as she tried to process this humiliation. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. There was an emptiness inside her, a pain so deep that it left her paralyzed. Clara looked at Daniel, searching for some sign of remorse, some trace of the boy who had once promised to always take care of her. But all she saw was indifference. The man in front of her didn't care. He saw her only as a passing inconvenience, someone he could discard without a second thought. Finally, Clara stood up from the table, her movements stiff and hesitant. She could no longer bear being in that place, in that atmosphere that seemed to suffocate her. "Thank you for your time, Daniel," she murmured, trying not to let her trembling voice betray her. Her dignity, though destroyed inside, still remained intact on the surface. Clara quickly turned away before he could see the tears that now silently streamed down her face. The rain tapped softly against Clara's windows, the sound echoing like a lament in the somber silence of the room. She sat on the floor of her living room, arms wrapped around her knees as tears streamed down her face. The humiliation she had suffered at Daniel's hands still burned in her mind, like an open wound that wouldn't stop throbbing. Every cruel word he had said seemed to resonate in the darkness around her, mixing with the sobs she could barely contain. The house, once a refuge, now felt like a reflection of her own pain, empty and cold. The world around Clara seemed to have lost all its color. Black and gray dominated her vision, and the weight of betrayal pressed on her chest with crushing force. Her mind kept returning to the meeting with Daniel, replaying every detail, every look of disdain, every cruel smile. She felt consumed by darkness, as if she were trapped in a nightmare from which she couldn't wake up. Loneliness seemed like a living entity surrounding her, suffocating her. For a moment she wished she could feel nothing. She wished the pain would dissipate, that the emptiness would take over everything. Maybe it would be easier that way, to simply stop fighting, to surrender to the suffering. But even as these shadows tried to engulf her, something inside Clara refused to be completely destroyed. There was a small flame of resistance deep within her, a strength that, though faint, still pulsed amidst the despair. The rain intensified outside, creating a sad melody that seemed to synchronize with Clara's tears. She stood up slowly, walking through the dark room like a lost soul without direction. Her mind was in turmoil, but amid the emotional chaos, a new feeling began to emerge: anger. It wasn't explosive, impulsive anger, but a cold, silent rage that took root in her heart like a bitter seed. This was more than just simple hurt. It was betrayal. And Clara, with every fiber of her being, felt that she couldn't simply accept it. She stopped in front of the window, watching the raindrops slide down the glass. Her reflection in the window looked like that of another person. Someone who had been broken, but who, beneath the cracks, still had unsuspected strength. Clara clenched her fists, feeling her frustration and pain slowly transform into an unstoppable determination. She wasn't the weak and helpless woman that Daniel thought she was. He had underestimated her spirit, and now, something inside her was beginning to change. Feeling the weight of humiliation being replaced by a fierce will to fight, Clara moved through the house, her mind working faster than her steps. Daniel had destroyed any hope of reconciliation. He was no longer the childhood friend, but a cruel man, willing to step on anyone necessary to maintain his comfort. And she, in her pain, realized that she couldn't allow him to continue like that, untouchable, above everything and everyone. A plan began to form in her mind, still nebulous but growing. Clara knew she needed to compose herself, to think coldly and calculatedly, just as Daniel had done to her. There was something she could do, something that went beyond simply demanding a debt. Daniel had made choices throughout his life that he had carefully hidden, choices Clara was determined to uncover. If he thought she couldn't defend herself, he was wrong. She looked around her house, the once familiar environment now transformed into a kind of mental battlefield. Clara could no longer live in the shadow of that humiliation. She couldn't continue to be the victim. Her mind, now focused, began to revisit memories of when Daniel was a constant presence in her life. Small details, seemingly innocent conversations, things she had never considered important, began to take on new light. The pieces of the puzzle were there, and Clara felt that if she could piece them together, she could turn the game in her favor. The initial despair that had enveloped her hours before was beginning to dissipate, giving way to a kind of painful clarity. Clara knew her fight was just beginning, but for the first time since her mother's death, she felt a spark of purpose. She stood up, wiping the remaining tears from her face, her gaze fixed on the horizon beyond the dark window. The night was still out there, heavy and relentless, but inside her, the light of determination had been ignited. And that light, even small, was strong enough to guide her on the path she was about to take. The day dawned gray, but Clara felt different. There was something new in her, an unwavering determination. She knew she could no longer let the humiliation dictate her actions. The previous night had been a turning point. As she watched the fine rain slide down the window, Clara decided that she would no longer be the silent victim. She would investigate Daniel's life, uncover his secrets, and find a way to seek justice. Daniel had done something much worse than simply ignoring his debt. He had underestimated her. And now she was determined to prove him wrong. The first step would be to reconnect with old friendships, people she knew might still have some kind of connection with Daniel. Clara spent the following days sending messages, making calls, discreetly probing the few people who still had ties to her former friend. It was a risky move, but Clara was careful. She knew Daniel had influence and that any wrong move could alert him. However, Clara also knew that no one is untouchable, not even Daniel with his facade of success. The answers started to come. Slowly and cautiously, Clara began to gather information. Mutual friends talked about Daniel's meteoric business success, but as she asked more specific questions, the answers became more evasive. There was something hidden behind his wealth, something few dared to mention. Clara realized she was touching on sensitive points, but that only encouraged her even more. She felt she was on the verge of discovering something big. Clara remembered one person in particular, Marcos, an old acquaintance of Daniel who had distanced himself from the group years ago, right when Daniel began amassing wealth. Clara sought Marcos out at a discreet bar, where he worked as a manager. The conversation was initially friendly, but as soon as Daniel's name came up, Marcos's demeanor changed. He hesitated, his eyes narrowing with caution, as if he had been reminded of something dangerous. Clara knew she had found someone who knew more than he was willing to tell. "Look, Clara," Marcos began, his voice low and filled with uncertainty. "Daniel is not the same guy we used to know. He's gotten involved with the wrong people. If I were you, I'd stop digging where you shouldn't." There was palpable fear in his words, but Clara didn't back down. She insisted, gently, reminding Marcos how close he and Daniel used to be and how she only wanted to understand what had happened to her friend. Eventually Marcos gave in, but not before casting a warning glance. "You won't like what you're going to find." Marcos gave Clara a subtle hint about Daniel's connections. There were names of influential people involved in activities that couldn't easily be exposed. Marcos didn't provide many details, but indicated that Daniel's business dealings weren't as clean as they seemed. Clara left the bar with her heart racing. Now she had a concrete lead, something to follow. Daniel, the man who always posed as a successful and influential businessman, had dangerous connections that could be his downfall. When she got home, Clara began following the leads with more focus. Using social media and some trusted contacts, she dived into obsessive research. She spent sleepless nights connecting dots, cross-referencing information, discovering small details that, on their own, seemed harmless, but together began to reveal a much darker picture. Daniel's perfect life was, in fact, built on rotten foundations, supported by shady deals and corrupt alliances. Clara began to realize that Daniel had become more than just a ruthless businessman. He was involved in something bigger, something dangerous. With every discovery, she delved deeper, and with each new piece of the puzzle, she felt her anger transform into something colder and more calculated. If Daniel believed he could escape unscathed after humiliating and betraying her, he was deeply mistaken. Clara now had a mission. She knew she needed to be careful. Daniel had power and influence, and any reckless move could ruin everything. But the feeling that she was getting closer to the truth kept pushing her forward. With each new piece of information, Clara saw her opportunity to finally turn the tables, to show Daniel that he was not untouchable. She didn't yet know exactly how she would do it, but the certainty that Daniel would pay for his actions kept her steady on her path. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she held the envelope that had been discreetly delivered to her mailbox. It was a cloudy morning, but for her, time seemed to stand still, frozen in that exact moment when the unexpected invaded her life. Clara opened the envelope with anxious fingers and found inside a series of documents. As she examined them, she immediately realized what she had in her hands: evidence. Falsified tax documents, contracts signed by Daniel with shell companies, bank transactions that made no sense at all. Everything pointed to a network of illegal activities that he had carefully hidden for years. The initial shock gave way to a different emotion. Clara felt a chill run down her spine as she flipped through page after page. In her hands was the confirmation that Daniel had gotten involved in something much larger than mere dishonest business practices. He was entrenched in a network of corruption and financial crimes. Adrenaline began to pulse through her veins. She had something powerful in her hands, something that could not only destroy Daniel but also completely change the course of her own life. Clara leaned back in her chair, feeling a mixture of fear and euphoria. If this evidence came to light, Daniel could lose everything: his reputation, his money, his freedom. It was hard to believe that the man she had known since childhood had become entangled in something so dark. Yet now she understood why he had distanced himself so much, why his coldness was not just a personality trait but an armor to protect his secrets. She stood up and began to pace around the room, trying to process what this all meant. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of control, a sense that she could finally free herself from the crushing weight of debts and humiliation. She knew that, with this evidence, she could demand not just the money Daniel owed her, but also ensure that he paid for the dirty choices he had made over the years. His fate was in her hands, and that electrified her. At the same time, Clara couldn't ignore the danger this represented. Daniel had powerful allies, people who likely wouldn't hesitate to protect their own interests. She was stepping into dangerous territory and needed to be smart about how she used the information she had obtained. She sat down again, her heart racing, and began to mentally outline her next steps. She couldn't act impulsively. She needed to play the same game Daniel had been playing for all these years, with precision. Clara spent the night analyzing the documents, making sure everything made sense. She was meticulous, every detail mattered. With every new discovery, her confidence grew. The puzzle of Daniel's secret life was coming together before her eyes, and the final picture was much darker than she had ever imagined. Now there was no turning back. She had entered deeply into this dangerous game, but she was willing to go all the way no matter how much it terrified her. As the day broke, Clara felt exhaustion wash over her body, but her spirit was more awake than ever. She finally had the weapons necessary to confront Daniel on equal footing. And, more than that, she had the power to make him answer for all his actions, both against her and against the others he had wronged. The shadows of the past were about to swallow Daniel, and Clara in some way felt a strange justice forming. She would no longer allow herself to be crushed by the pain he had caused. The phone rang, breaking the silence. It was a call from one of the few contacts Clara still maintained, confirming that the documents she had shown were genuine. That was all she needed to know. With that, Clara knew the noose was starting to tighten. With each new piece she gathered, the scale of Daniel's crimes became clearer. He wasn't just a corrupt businessman. He had built an illegal empire, manipulating the lives of many to stay on top. Clara took a deep breath, the weight of responsibility pressing on her shoulders. The temptation to simply use the evidence to recover the money and move on was strong, but she knew she couldn't stop there. Something bigger was at stake. It was the chance to bring justice, to show that even the most powerful can fall. She wiped her tired but determined face and prepared for what was to come. The confrontation was near, and Clara knew she had to be ready. With the evidence in hand, Clara felt that her moment was approaching. Daniel had become a dangerous man, but now she was also armed not with fear but with the truth. And the truth, she knew, was the most lethal weapon she could wield. The hall was filled with important people, influential figures from the city mingling between glasses of champagne and conversations muffled by the soft music playing in the background. The event, a charity fundraiser, brought together businesspeople, politicians, and local celebrities in an atmosphere of luxury and elegance. Golden lights hung over the grand hall, reflecting off the shimmer of expensive dresses and polite smiles. Clara entered the room, her heart pounding in her chest, but her steps firm and determined. She didn't belong to that world, but at that moment none of it mattered. Today would be the day when the truth came to light. She spotted Daniel in the center of the room, surrounded by people laughing at his jokes and admiring his charismatic presence. He was impeccably dressed, with a confident smile, as if nothing could shake his position. Clara observed him for a few seconds, feeling a mix of anger and disgust. He still acted as though he was untouchable, as though he had the world at his feet. But his world was about to crumble. With the evidence carefully tucked away in her bag, Clara knew the time had come to act. She took a deep breath and advanced toward the group surrounding Daniel. When he saw her approach, his smile faltered for a brief moment, but he quickly recovered his composure, putting on a facade of false sympathy. "Clara, what a surprise," he said, trying to sound casual. But there was a tension in his voice that only she could detect. Clara didn't smile back. Her face was serious, her eyes locked onto his, filled with an intensity that made Daniel straighten up a bit more. "Surprised, Daniel?" Clara responded, her voice cutting through the air between them like ice. The conversations around them began to quiet down as those nearby noticed the change in tone. She took a step forward, her voice clear and controlled. "Maybe the real surprise is that you still think you can hide everything. But I think today is the day when everyone here will learn who you really are." Silence fell like a weight over the group. All eyes were on Clara and Daniel. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but Clara didn't give him time. With a firm hand, she pulled the documents from her bag and held them up. "This man," she began, her voice projecting through the hall, "is not just the great businessman you think you know. He owes me a significant amount of money that he refused to pay, even knowing the situation I was in after my mother's death. But that's not all." She paused, watching the shock spread across the faces around her. "Daniel," Clara continued, her eyes flashing, "is not just a debtor but a criminal. I have proof here that shows his involvement in financial fraud and illegal dealings. He built his fortune on lies and crimes, manipulating everything and everyone to maintain his status." The reaction was immediate. Murmurs swept through the room, glances were exchanged, and people began to slowly distance themselves from Daniel, as though he were contagious. Daniel's face turned pale, but he still tried to maintain control. "This is ridiculous, Clara," he said, forcing a tense smile. "You have no idea what you're talking about. This is madness." But there was something in his voice that betrayed his panic. Clara knew he was trying to keep a grip on the situation, but the truth had already been released, and he could no longer control it. Clara stepped closer to Daniel, now speaking directly to him, ignoring the curious stares around them. "I have all the evidence, Daniel. Every transaction, every document you forged. And now everyone here knows who you really are. So stop pretending you're in control. Because from this moment on, you have no power over me." Daniel's expression shifted to something darker, a mixture of desperation and fury. He tried to hold on to his smile, but Clara could see the cracks in his facade. He looked around, seeing the suspicious glances now surrounding him. He was a man cornered, caught in the center of his own web of lies. The awkward silence in the hall was heavy, suffocating, and Clara felt the tension in the air grow with every second. She took a step back, allowing the moment to fully sink in. Daniel, once so self-assured, was losing control. The powerful man who had once publicly humiliated her now stood vulnerable, exposed in front of everyone. And for the first time, Clara felt the weight she had carried for so long begin to dissipate. The power Daniel had once wielded over her was broken. Now she faced him with the certainty that he had fallen. And nothing could erase the impact of that moment. The air in the hall seemed to vibrate with growing tension. Daniel, pale and cornered, was not used to being challenged, much less in public. His forced smile had disappeared, replaced by a calculating and desperate look. Clara, standing before him, felt the power of truth pulsing in her hands but knew that Daniel was not someone who would surrender so easily. He had built his life on manipulating people, and he wouldn't hesitate to try to turn the game in his favor one more time. "Clara," he began, his voice low, almost soft, desperately trying to bring back the charming and convincing man he had always been. "Let's resolve this in a civilized manner." He took a step toward her, slowly approaching as if trying to tame a wild animal. "I can pay you right here, right now. We can settle this debt and you can go back to having the life you always wanted. Think about it. You don't need to do this." Clara didn't move. Her eyes locked on his with a firmness he didn't recognize. "Settle the debt?" she repeated, her voice full of irony. "Now you want to talk about settling? After humiliating me, treating me like I was nothing, you think you can simply buy me off?" There was incredulity in her words, but also an unwavering strength. Clara was no longer the frightened and vulnerable woman he had once known. Daniel forced a smile, trying to hide the growing panic. "I was an idiot, Clara, I admit that. But we can fix this. I can give you more than just the money. Do you want opportunities? I can open doors for you, help you rebuild your life. Think about what this could mean. You don't have to be an enemy." He extended his hand as if a simple gesture could erase the past. But Clara was no longer playing his game. She looked at Daniel's extended hand for a long second before lifting her eyes to meet his directly. "You don't understand, do you, Daniel?" She took a step forward, making him hesitate, his hand slowly falling back to his side. "This isn't just about money. It's not about doors or opportunities. It's about responsibility. About you finally answering for everything you've done." Daniel tried to maintain control, but his confidence was clearly wavering. "Clara, you know how this world works. We all do what we have to do to survive. You helped me in the past, remember? We were friends, partners. I never meant to hurt you. It was a mistake. Let's move on." His voice was now almost pleading, the mask of power cracking as he realized that Clara wasn't yielding. "Friends?" Clara said, the word dripping with bitterness that surprised even her. "Friends don't treat others the way you treated me. Friends don't build empires of lies and throw away anyone who dares to stand up to them." Her eyes burned with determination. "You can try to manipulate other people, but with me that's over. I'm not the Clara you once knew. You lost that chance when you betrayed me." Daniel tried another approach, leaning in closer, lowering his voice as if he were confiding something important. "Clara, you know the truth is never that simple. If you go down this path, there's no turning back. It'll be the end for both of us. Think about the consequences. We can find a way out of this together like we did before." This was his last card, his final attempt to bring Clara back under his control. But Clara was beyond his reach now. Her eyes met his, and for the first time in a long time, she saw Daniel for what he really was. A desperate man struggling to hold on to the power that was quickly slipping through his fingers. "No, Daniel," she said calmly. "You're going to face the consequences alone this time." There was a quiet strength in her voice, a certainty that she was finally in control. Daniel, realizing that he had lost, took a step back, frustration visible in his eyes. He knew there was nothing more to say, that Clara was no longer manipulable. For the first time he stood before someone he couldn't control, someone who had completely disarmed him. The room seemed to fall into absolute silence, as if everyone there was holding their breath, waiting for the next move. Clara slowly turned without looking back. She left Daniel standing in the middle of the room, alone in his panic disguised as composure. She knew she had won this battle, but the real confrontation was only beginning. And this time, Clara was ready for whatever came next. Clara sat in the small, modest office of the police station, the incessant hum of the air conditioner buzzing in the background, while the officer in front of her examined the documents she had brought. Her breathing was heavy, the weight of what she was about to do still pressing on her chest, but her determination remained unshaken. The room felt suffocating, full of tension, but Clara kept her head high. The officer looked up at her, his expression serious. "Are you sure about this, ma'am?" he asked, as if still not fully believing the seriousness of the evidence before him. Clara simply nodded, her voice firm, despite the nervousness bubbling inside her. "I'm sure," she replied. "Daniel Moretti isn't just a successful businessman, he's a criminal. This evidence proves his involvement in illegal activities. He needs to be stopped." Clara spoke clearly, each word carrying a conviction that she had fought hard to find. She could no longer allow him to go unpunished. Not after everything he had done, not just to her but to everyone he had deceived over the years. The officer stood up and walked over to another officer, handing him the documents. There was a tense silence in the room as they exchanged serious glances. Clara watched every move intently, her heart racing as if each second prolonged the suspense. Finally, the officer returned and said, "We will proceed with the complaint. If what you're saying is confirmed, there's no way Daniel will escape the consequences." At that moment, Clara felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. The process was in motion and there was no turning back. She had done what needed to be done. However, even with the imminent sense of justice, a part of her still clung to the tension, fearing the next step. The wheels of justice moved slowly, and she knew Daniel wouldn't go down without a fight. He would try to use his influence, his connections, anything to get out of this situation. But Clara was prepared. For the first time in months, she felt like she was in control. Days later, the news began to circulate. Daniel Moretti, the renowned businessman, was being investigated for fraud and financial crimes. The local newspapers had already picked up the story, and the media was starting to take interest. Clara read the headlines with a mix of satisfaction and apprehension. Daniel was cornered. The rumors were spreading, and the corridors of his empire were filled with whispers. But as Clara watched everything unfold from a distance, she knew the decisive moment was yet to come. And then, the day of the arrest came. Clara was at home when she received the call. "Miss Clara? We got him. Daniel was arrested this morning." The officer's voice sounded firm, and when Clara heard the words, she felt a chill run down her spine. She thanked him, hung up the phone, and stood still for a moment, absorbing the weight of it all. Daniel Moretti, the man who believed he was above everything and everyone, was now behind bars. Clara walked to the window and looked out at the world, which somehow seemed to have changed even though everything was the same. Justice, something that had once seemed so distant, was finally beginning to take shape. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the mix of emotions inside her. There was deep relief but also a certain sadness. Not for the man Daniel had become, but for the boy she had once known, the friend who had promised to protect her. She knew Daniel had tried to resist, of course. He had tried to use his influence to escape, made frantic calls, activated lawyers, contacted old allies. But this time there was no way out. The evidence was overwhelming, and his empire was crumbling around him like a house of cards. Clara knew he was desperate, trying to cling to the last threads of control he had left. But his world, the one he had built on lies, was finally falling apart. The sound of sirens, the click of handcuffs. Clara could imagine the moment even though she wasn't there. Daniel being taken away, no longer the powerful man who had humiliated her, but a prisoner about to face the justice he had so long avoided. She didn't take pleasure in it, but there was a sense that things at last were where they should be. And as she looked out at the horizon through the window, she knew this was just the beginning of something new. Something that she, alone, had achieved. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, onlookers, and even people who had been affected by Daniel's shady business dealings filled the benches, eager to witness the downfall of the once untouchable businessman. Clara sat in the front row, her body tense as she watched the scene unfold before her. The sound of camera flashes echoed through the hall, blending with the murmurs of those present. At the center of it all, Daniel sat in the defendant's chair, his expression a mix of coldness and exhaustion. It was hard to believe that the man she had once known was now sitting there, so exposed, so vulnerable. When the judge entered the room, silence fell quickly. Clara felt her heart race, knowing that the next moments would reveal everything. For weeks, prosecutors had been gathering the evidence she had helped uncover: falsified contracts, illegal transfers, offshore accounts. Now justice was about to be served. The prosecutor stood and began presenting the case with surgical precision, each word weighing on Daniel's shoulders like a hammer. With every new revelation, Clara watched the faces of the people around her, shocked by what they were hearing. Daniel, once so confident, began to lose his composure. His face, once marked by unshakable confidence, was now pale and lined with desperation. He avoided Clara's gaze, but she couldn't take her eyes off him. It was like watching the disintegration of an illusion she had carried for far too long. The childhood friend, the charismatic man, was being replaced by a criminal, whose lies and greed had finally led him to this point. There was something painfully final about seeing him there, powerless as his frauds were exposed to the world. The witnesses were called, each one helping to build the image of a man who had not only betrayed her trust but also that of countless other people. Clara listened to the stories of ruined business owners, of families who had lost everything, and felt a mix of relief and sorrow. She wasn't alone in her pain. Daniel had devastated many lives, and now everyone could see the true face of the man he had become. Every detail of his downfall was meticulously dissected before everyone. As the trial progressed, Clara realized that, although she had wanted justice, she didn't feel the sense of revenge she had once expected. Instead of satisfaction, she felt an odd emptiness. Daniel was being punished, and that was right. But the idea of revenge she had nursed for so long now seemed small compared to the reality of the situation. What she really wanted wasn't to see him destroyed, but to regain the peace he had taken from her. And that, somehow, felt closer than she had imagined. Daniel was called to the stand, and the courtroom fell into absolute silence. Everyone was waiting to hear his defense, but Daniel's words came out broken and hesitant. He still tried to maintain a facade, blaming the system, the circumstances, trying to deflect responsibility. But Clara could see beyond that. He was finished and everyone knew it. The tears he tried to hide behind his choked voice didn't move the audience. The empire of lies he had built was crumbling before his eyes, and there was no escaping the truth anymore. When the verdict was read, the air in the courtroom seemed frozen. Guilty. The word echoed in the room, bringing with it a sense of closure that Clara hadn't realized she needed. Daniel lowered his head, finally defeated. Upon hearing the sentence, Clara felt an enormous weight lift from her shoulders. It was as if, after months of pain, she could finally breathe again. The man she had once considered her friend had fallen, and the cycle of suffering he had caused was, in some way, being closed there. But with the relief came a deep sadness. Clara knew that, despite all the justice being done, she could never erase what had happened. Daniel, the boy with whom she had shared so many memories, was lost forever. The void that left was undeniable. Even so, she knew it was time to move on, to let go of the weight of the past and look to the future with new eyes. What mattered now was what she would do with her newfound freedom. As Daniel was escorted out of the courtroom, Clara remained in her seat for a few moments. She watched the cameras flash, the reporters scrambling to capture the moment. But for her, the noise around her felt distant. There was an unexpected calm inside her, as if the world had finally aligned with the truth she had longed for. Daniel was out of her life, and with him, the power he had once held over her had vanished. Clara stood up slowly, leaving the courtroom without looking back. The case was closed, and she knew that, painful as the journey had been, she had come out stronger. There was a new chapter waiting for her, and she was ready to write it without the shadows of the past clouding her way. The fresh morning air filled Clara's lungs as she walked through the streets of the city. The soft light of the autumn sun pierced through the leaves of the trees, creating a play of shadows and golden glimmers around her. There was a lightness in her steps, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Daniel was in jail, the debt that had haunted her like a ghost had been paid, and finally Clara felt free. It wasn't just a financial freedom, but something much deeper. The freedom to be herself without carrying the weight of past lies and betrayals. Her house, which had once felt full of shadows and painful memories, now felt like a refuge of tranquility. Clara had spent the last few days reorganizing the space, filling it with life again. Fresh flowers adorned the corners of the room, natural light flowed through the windows she used to keep closed. There was a palpable peace in every detail surrounding her. Clara spent more time outdoors, tending to the small garden she had neglected for so long. Each new plant that blossomed seemed like a symbol of her own renewal. The nightmares that had once haunted her every night had become less frequent, replaced by peaceful dreams of a future that now seemed possible. For the first time in a long time, Clara woke up without the weight of despair pressing on her chest. The anxiety that had once dominated her days was now replaced by a deep calm. She still had a lot to rebuild, but the difference now was that there was no longer the constant fear of being swallowed by debts or the shadow of Daniel. One morning, Clara received an unexpected call from an old friend, offering her a new job opportunity. She accepted it with a smile, one that hadn't appeared so genuinely on her face in a long time. It was no longer about surviving, but about living, building something that was hers alone, without depending on anyone. The confidence in herself was returning little by little, and she knew that, no matter how difficult the journey had been, the strength she now carried within herself was unshakable. The walks through the city became part of her new routine. Clara rediscovered the small pleasures of life, like stopping at a cafe to read a book, or simply feeling the wind on her face while watching people pass by. Every moment felt like a gift. She was no longer trapped in the past, and for the first time in a long time, the future didn't scare her. On the contrary, she looked forward to it with curiosity and determination. One afternoon, Clara walked to a park she used to visit as a child. Sitting on a bench under the shade of an old tree, she reflected on the long journey she had traveled. The scars she carried wouldn't disappear, but they no longer defined her. There was a new strength within her, one that came from knowing she had overcome what had seemed impossible. She was no longer that fragile woman who depended on others to stay afloat. Clara had learned to trust in herself and to find her own voice. The money Daniel owed her had been paid, but unlike what she had thought, it wasn't the financial sum that made her feel complete. It was the fact that she had regained her dignity, that she had sought justice for herself. The money was just a detail. What really mattered was the feeling that, finally, she was in control of her own life. And that, Clara knew, was the true reward of her struggle. The days became lighter, and Clara began to plan small projects she had never allowed herself to dream of before. Learning a new language, maybe traveling to places she had always wanted to visit, or simply continuing to care for the garden that bloomed before her eyes. Each step was an affirmation of her new life, a life built with her own hands. As the afternoon turned to evening, Clara felt a soft breeze blow, bringing with it a sense of gratitude. No matter how painful the past had been, she knew that without it, she wouldn't have discovered the strength that had always been inside her. The darkness had passed, and now everything seemed clearer, more luminous. The world, which once felt so heavy, was now full of possibilities. And for the first time, Clara knew she could embrace them without fear. The sky was clear and blue, dotted with a few white clouds that moved slowly with the light morning breeze. Clara was walking through the cemetery, her steps slow and calm. The trees around swayed gently, and the distant sound of birds created a melody that brought peace. There was something deeply serene about that day, something Clara felt in the depths of her soul. She was there to say goodbye, not with sadness but with a sense of relief, of gratitude. Finally, life seemed to be in the right place. Reaching her mother's grave, Clara knelt and gently ran her hand over the cold stone, her touch carrying a silent reverence. "Hi, Mom," she whispered, her voice softly breaking the silence around her. "I did it." The words came with emotion, but this time, there were no tears of pain or regret. Only calm and acceptance of what had been and what was now coming. "I did what needed to be done, the way you always taught me." She took a deep breath, allowing herself to feel the weight of the moment. Clara's life had been a cycle of challenges, losses, and victories, but she knew as she stood there, that it had all taught her what really mattered. Her mother had been her greatest inspiration, her greatest strength, and Clara could now feel at peace for having honored that legacy. She had fought with courage, faced the past, and now, finally, she could let it rest. The wind blew gently, lifting a few dry leaves around, as if the world was in harmony with Clara's state of mind. "I miss you every day," she continued, her voice even softer now. "But I know you're at peace, and so am I." Clara smiled lightly, a sweet sadness in her heart, but also a new hope emerging from the midst of that longing. She stayed there for a little while longer, just feeling her mother's presence, the wind, and the nature around her. There was no need to say anything else because the connection between them went beyond words. Clara knew that her mother would always be with her, in one way or another, and that was enough. When she finally stood up, she felt as though a new door was opening. The farewell wasn't bitter but an acceptance that life needed to move forward, and she was ready for the next chapter. As she walked away from the grave, Clara felt a mixture of relief and renewal. The weight of debts, humiliation, and the past were being left behind, and she was light, almost floating. The world in front of her seemed full of possibilities, and for the first time, Clara didn't feel afraid of them. There was something new in her steps, a serene determination, a strength that she had discovered within herself throughout the entire process. And that strength would guide her no matter where she went. Clara continued to walk through the cemetery, but now with a lightness that surprised her. She looked toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to rise higher in the sky. The light shone on her face, warming her skin as if life itself was offering her a new opportunity, full of light and hope. Clara smiled to herself, truly feeling that the future was in her hands, and she was ready to embrace it with all the courage she had found. The past was buried, not only at her mother's grave but also in her heart. Clara had sought justice, had freed herself from the chains that Daniel and the mistakes of the past had placed on her. Now the future was hers. Without fear, without shadows. Only Clara, ready to truly live, ready to be who she had always been destined to be, a strong, resilient woman and at peace with herself. And so, as the sun continued to rise in the sky and the wind gently blew around her, Clara moved forward. Life at last seemed new, full of possibilities. She didn't look back because now, everything that mattered was ahead of her. The path was hers and Clara was ready to walk it in peace, with a light heart and a free soul. The cycle was complete, and her journey had finally come to an end. An end that didn't need anything more, just the certainty that, from now on, everything was right. If you enjoyed Clara's incredible story, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of the upcoming videos. If you love emotional chronicles and want to support our channel to keep bringing more quality content, consider contributing through Buy Me a Coffee. The link is in the first pinned comment. Your help is essential for us to continue improving. Thank you for your support. See you in the next emotional chronicle.